right, hello everyone. So thanks for coming. So I'm Ankur Moitra. I'm a faculty member in the math department at MIT. And today I get to tell you about a topic that I'm really interested in these days, robustness. So robustness can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And in this two-part tutorial, I'm going to explore some different aspects of robustness and how it interacts with algorithm design. So let me tell you at the outset what this first talk is going to be about. It's going to be about having your cake and eating it too. Getting provably robust estimators in high dimensions, but getting it without the computational intractability. So really, before I go there, before I go to robust estimation in high dimensions, let me start off with robust estimation in one dimension. And before I do that, let's actually just start off with parameter estimation. So let me make sure that we're all on the same page here. And let me tell you about classic parameter estimation, just so that we have some notation in mind for the rest of the talk. So what is classic parameter estimation? This will be the basic setup of this talk, is that we're going to be given samples from some unknown distribution, but it's going to live in some known class of distributions. So one canonical thing to keep in mind is what if we're given samples from, for example, a Gaussian, where we just don't know what its mean mu is and its variance sigma squared is. So we want to know in classic parameter estimation, can we accurately estimate these unknown parameters given few samples? So here in the setting where we're given samples that actually do come from a Gaussian, well, the answer to this question is a duh, obviously yes. So all we have to do is we can use the empirical averages. So if our samples really came from a one-dimensional Gaussian, we can take the empirical mean, take capital N samples, take the average, and that's going to converge very quickly to the underlying parameter mu, the true mean we're looking for. And the same way we can take the empirical variance, where we let x bar denote the empirical mean, and we take the empirical variance, and that's going to converge very quickly to sigma squared. So this is classic parameter estimation. In fact, these two estimators, the empirical mean and the empirical variance, are really just special cases of this general paradigm, which is maximum likelihood estimation. So this was pioneered by Fisher in the early 1900s, and he proved a lot of wonderful properties about the maximum likelihood estimator, that under pretty nice conditions, it turns out that the maximum likelihood estimator is asymptotically efficient, meaning that it converges very quickly, as fast as any other estimator, to the true parameters you're looking for. But this talk is not about the maximum likelihood estimator. It's not about what happens when you're given samples from some model that really lives in some class. It's about what happens when there are actually errors in the model itself. This question could have been asked very early at the inception of statistics, but really took its modern form in the work of Tutrial in the 1960s, where he started empirically studying this question about learning the parameters of a one-dimensional Gaussian given some noise to the distribution, so that your samples didn't actually come from a Gaussian. So robust statistics since then has blossomed into a big field, which conceptually what it studies is the following question. Well, we know what estimators behave well when we're given samples from our true model, but what estimators behave well in a neighborhood around the true model? So even when there are deviations to our modeling assumptions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first build up a simple one-dimensional example to show you how robust statistics works in one dimension. And then we're going to move on to high-dimensional settings, where there will be an interesting interplay between robust statistics and algorithm design. So let's study a one-dimensional example, and let's start off with the most basic question, which is what do we mean by a model around the true? What do we mean about a neighborhood around the true model? So what we're really asking is, how do we constrain the noise of our distribution? So one way to think about it is, I'll give you two equivalent ways to think about it. One is that we can take this little squiggle, which we think of as the deviation in our model from actually being Gaussian. And one thing we can do is we can constrain the L1 norm of this noise, just to make sure that it's not too large a norm. But the other thing that we can do is we can also think about it instead as being like the following. So if we think about this little red squiggle as being this perturbation of this true blue Gaussian model to this green model that we actually observe samples from, then one way to think about constraining the L1 norm of the noise is that what we're really doing is that it's like allowing an adversary to take a bunch of samples from our model and then corrupt some epsilon fraction of those samples. So in fact, we're going to work with a really strong model in this talk. So the model is that we're given samples from a one-dimensional Gaussian. Then our adversary sees those samples and is allowed to arbitrarily move any epsilon fraction of those samples he wants and do whatever he wants to them. So this is our notion of a neighborhood around the true model, is that they originally came from a Gaussian, but then he's allowed to make these slight tweaks, either by adding this small little squiggle, which is constrained in its L1 norm, or by taking the samples and actually moving some small fraction of them however he pleases. So just to introduce some nomenclature that will be useful in this talk. Well, I'm going to refer to inliers as being the points that the adversary doesn't touch. Those are the ones which really did come from our underlying Gaussian. And the outlier is going to be the ones that he's gotten his hands on and he did whatever he wanted with them. So this is robust statistics. So this is our notion of a neighborhood around the true model. And the only other question that I have to answer to try and formalize what robust statistics is doing in one dimension is I have to formalize what I want out of my estimator. So we're given samples from something that's close to being Gaussian. And we want, at the end of the day, is we want to learn something that's close to that original Gaussian we're getting samples from. So the other thing that I have to do to specify this question is to define a norm in which I want the parameters of my estimates to be close to the true parameters before there were corruptions. So of course there's a very natural norm at play in all of this. It's the total variation distance. So if you take two density functions, all it is it's half of the L1 distance between them. And so one way to think about it is that the way we've set up our problem is that we have this ideal model, which really is a Gaussian with some unknown mean u and variance sigma squared. And our observed model is close in total variation distance. It's epsilon close. That's the promise. That's the notion of the neighborhood around the true model that we're working with. Well, our goal then is to try and find an estimate within this family, so another Gaussian with some parameter, some mean mu hat and variance sigma hat squared, so that our estimate is close to the true model according to the total variation distance. So we have the promise at the start of the problem that we were close in total variation distance to this family of Gaussians. And what we want to do is we want to denoise our observation and find some estimate that really is in the family that's close to this idealized model that we're observing corruptions from. Another way to think about it is that we're just looking in our observed distribution for some member of our family, an actual Gaussian that's close according to this total variation distance. So this is our problem, is we want to, given samples which are epsilon close to a Gaussian, recover something else that's O of epsilon close to the original Gaussian. And so I mentioned at the outset when we talked about classic parameter estimation, there are really simple things you can do. You can take a bunch of samples and take the empirical mean and the empirical variance, and those work really well. That's the setting of maximum likelihood estimation. But here, once we allow an adversary to actually corrupt some small fraction of our samples, all of a sudden, we're faced with a very different kind of estimation problem. This is the nature of robust statistics. So do the empirical mean and empirical variance work? Well, the answer here is another resounding no. So what goes wrong is that even just a single sample can arbitrarily corrupt the empirical mean and empirical variance. So our adversary, remember, he's only allowed to play with a very small amount of our distribution. But even by corrupting just a single point and moving it all the way out there, our observed model, what's going to happen is it's going to look like this. And the problem is that even the single corrupted sample can arbitrarily corrupt the new mean. So if we take the mean of this observed model, it's actually diverging as the adversary pushes that sample further and further out to infinity. So this is really what robust statistics is about the fact that the empirical mean and empirical variance, while being very efficient when you're given samples from the true distribution, stop working once you have any deviations from your model. So here, for example, in this case, there are estimators that do work. So instead of using the mean, the empirical mean, what you should do instead is use the median. Intuitively, this is very clear because, if you were to take the empirical median and then an adversary adds a slight corruption out in the tail, then he can only pull you a little bit outside of the peak of this distribution. So the median still works even though the mean goes off to infinity. And what you should do instead of using the empirical variance is, well, if the median worked once, you just use the median a bunch more times. So what you do is you can do something called the median absolute deviation. So here you take your median of your observed samples, and you look at the absolute value of the difference between the sample and the median, and you take the median of those values. It turns out that that actually really does work in the presence of corruptions. So this is one of the standard prescriptions in robust statistics. It's very easy to understand what's going on in one dimension, is that when your plug-in estimators like the empirical mean and empirical variance don't work, what you try and do is you try and design estimators that are surrogates that are much less sensitive to a single sample being corrupted. And you can end up with very nice theorems in the one-dimensional case. So here's a folklore theorem just to make sure we understand what's going on in one dimension. Is it turns out that if I'm given samples from a distribution that's epsilon close to a Gaussian, meaning that an adversary is corrupted an epsilon fraction of n, well then what we can do is we can take those samples, we can compute the median, that'll be your estimate u hat, and we can compute the median absolute deviation, that'll be sigma hat. And the really strong robustness property that this satisfies is that when we plug in those estimates, we get a Gaussian, which is close in total variation distance to our original Gaussian. So this is the best possible guarantee you can have. You started off with something that's epsilon close to a Gaussian, you compute the median and median absolute deviation, and you get estimates that are so good that they're epsilon close in total variation distance again. So this is really, the holy grail of what we're looking for, and designing algorithms that are robust in one dimension is pretty easy because you can do simple things like this. But as soon as we go to high dimensions, things are going to go wrong. So now just to introduce one more piece of nomenclature. I'm a theoretical computer scientist, and a lot of these questions are studied within theory as well. And what this is sometimes called is it would be called proper agnostically learning of a 1D Gaussian. So let me walk you through this. It's an agnostic learning algorithm because we're no longer making the assumption that our samples really do come from a Gaussian. We're agnostic to whether or not they really are a Gaussian, but if they're close to a Gaussian, we want to find something that's close as well. That's usually what the notion of agnostic means. And it's proper because we're even asking something stronger of our algorithms. We want to actually find a Gaussian, something from our original family. So this oftentimes is called proper agnostic learning. And this shows us this folklore fact that we can have the best of all possible worlds. We get provably robust estimators, which are also efficiently computable. So now I can at least get to what the main point of this talk is it's about trying to understand what happens in high dimensions, because there'll be a very interesting tension between robustness and computational complexity once we move to high dimensional settings. So one example to keep in the back of your mind, which we'll come back to later, are, for example, high dimensional estimation problems that arise in things like genetics. So things like microarrays and genome-wide association schemes where you're really working in a very large dimensional space, oftentimes with things like 10,000 genes. All right, so now I can get to what will be the main point of this talk. The first part of this tutorial is robustness meets algorithms, is how to get provably robust estimators in high dimensions that are also computationally efficient. So first let me tell you what the main question I'm going to be interested in. It's the same exact question we've seen before, but now everything is going to happen in d dimensions. So once again, we're given samples not from a true Gaussian, but something that's close to a Gaussian. So what if we're given samples from a distribution in d dimensions, which is epsilon close in total variation distance to a Gaussian? So it has a mean mu, but that's now a length d vector, and it has a covariance sigma, but that's a d by d matrix. And what we want to do is we want to find estimates mu hat and sigma hat that are good, that are close in the total variation distance. So we're given something that's close in total variation distance. We want to find something that's also close in total variation distance. And there'll be two special cases that I'll be interested in. So one special case is, which will be very useful for us, is what if I promise you, for example, that the covariance is the identity? So I promise you that the variance is the same in all directions for this unknown Gaussian, and your only goal is to try and learn the mean. This, in the nomenclature of robust statistics, is often called robust estimation of location, because we're looking for the mean of some distribution. Another special case of this problem that will be interesting is when the mean is 0 and the variance is the only thing that's unknown. This is often called robust estimation of scale. So these are the two canonical problems in robust statistics: robust estimation of location and of scale. All right, so now I can tell you what this tension about robustness and algorithm design is really about. So there's, of course, dozens and dozens of estimators in robust statistics that have been proposed. But the amazing thing is the tension they're going to observe between the error guarantee they get, and the running time. So, if the median worked in one dimension for robustly estimating the mean, then the natural thing to do in high dimensions is to try and find an analog of the median that works just as well. So there's a very natural thing called the Tukey median, which I'm not going to define because I want to keep the technical baggage low for this talk. But it turns out that the Tukey median has the best possible error guarantee you could hope for. You're given something that's epsilon close in total variation. You find something that's O of epsilon close, again in the same metric. But there's a big problem, which is that the Tukey median is NP hard. So what this means is that in order to compute it in d dimensions, you have to run in roughly n to the d time. So even though there are provably robust estimators out there, even in the special case where the covariance is the identity, and all we want to do is find this d-dimensional mean vector, well, we can't necessarily compute those estimators because you just can't compute them beyond, say, very small dimension, like dimension 6. Now, there are actually other ways that you could try and generalize the median to high dimensions. There's a much more naive thing. You could do something like the geometric median, or a median where you do something coordinate-wise along each of the coordinates, and don't care about how the thing looks in high dimensions, because you're just caring about the distribution on individual coordinates. Now, this is great because you can compute it very efficiently. So you can compute it in polynomial time. But it has a terrible error guarantee. So all of a sudden, instead of having O of epsilon error guarantee, it has error guarantee epsilon times root d. So what this means is if you're given samples from something that's epsilon close to a Gaussian, so an adversary corrupts, say, 1% of your samples, well then all you're going to be able to guarantee out of the output of this algorithm is that it's 0.01 times root d close to the original Gaussian. So this is something which, as I'll explain in the next slide, is really terrible when we think about high-dimensional problems. When you plug in d equals 1, you don't see this issue, but as soon as you move to high dimensions, then all of a sudden this tension between robustness and running time becomes very palpable. Now there are all sorts of other things which exhibit the same type of tension. There are ways that what you can do is you can use your data to find some estimates of the mean and variance and run some sort of tournament on these different hypotheses. That gets exactly the same type of tension. It gets you an error guarantee which is O of epsilon, but runs in time n to the d. And there are even naive things like pruning, where, in high dimensions, what's really going on is that for a Gaussian with covariance to the identity, all the points are about root d away from the mean. So if you just threw away all of the points which are just stupidly far away from the others, you would end up with some estimate that's epsilon times root d close. And that's really, that naive thing is the best that's known for efficient algorithms. So I could do this full list with all sorts of other estimators, but I think you get the point. And what this really brings into focus is this conceptual question. So the problem is that all the known estimators in high dimensions, even for the case of just estimating the mean of a Gaussian with known covariance identity, they all are either hard to compute, so they're things like the Tukey median where they're NP hard, they run in n to the d time, or they lose some big polynomial factor in the dimension in their error guarantee. So just to put this in perspective, what this means is that the total variation distance between two distributions is only ever at most 1. So if you ask the question, what fraction of errors can these estimators tolerate and get non-trivial guarantees on their closeness, the answer is at most something like 1 over root d. So what this means is that as you take d to be larger and larger, think about our microarray example with d being 10,000, it means that you can only tolerate a really vanishing fraction of errors, even though in principle there are estimators that could tolerate much larger dimension-independent fractions of errors. We just don't necessarily know how to compute them. So this brings up a conceptual question, which is, how bad is computational intractability? How scared of it should you be when you talk about robust estimation, particularly in high dimensions? So is robust estimation algorithmically even possible in high dimensions? Is this tension somehow fundamental? So let me tell you about some recent results. So this is one I'm particularly excited about, done with some really terrific co-authors, Ilias Diakonopoulos, Jerry Lee, Gautam Khanna, Daniel Kane, and Alistair Stewart, which gives dimension-independent robustness in polynomial time. So if you're given samples from a d-dimensional Gaussian with unknown mean mu and unknown covariance sigma, and the samples you're getting are epsilon close in total variation distance to a Gaussian, so an adversary is corrupted an epsilon fraction of them arbitrarily, well, there's a polynomial time algorithm for spitting out estimates mu hat and sigma hat, which, as a Gaussian, they're within epsilon times polylog 1 over epsilon in total variation distance. So that means that all of a sudden there's no more d's here, so you really can tolerate some universal constant factors of robustness independent of the dimension. So maybe I'll just skip this part, but there's some interesting qualitative aspects about how this relates to beyond worst case analysis that I'm going to bring out in the second half of this tutorial. So around the same time, there was also other work of Lai, Rao, and Topala that showed that if you're given samples that's epsilon close to being Gaussian, then what they output is something, they find estimates mu hat and sigma hat, which in Euclidean distance, mu hat is within root epsilon, and sigma hat is within root epsilon, and there's some logarithmic factors in D. So what this means, actually, when you translate it to things like total variation distance, where covariances are somewhat bounded, it gives you about root epsilon guarantees. So what this tutorial really is about how to get robust estimation in high dimensions with computationally efficient methods, and about all of this progress that's happened very recently. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and walk you through where this epsilon times root d bottleneck came from before, but how simple spectral insights can actually help you detect and correct corruptions in a way that you get these strong robustness guarantees. So what I want you to get out of the first part of this talk is I want to show you that actually robust estimation in high dimensions actually becomes pretty formulaic when you understand it in the right way. So in fact, there's a general recipe to how to go about looking for robust estimators in high dimensions. So this recipe, which I'm going to explain in a few examples, is the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to find a good parameter distance to work with, something that's a little bit easier to wrap your head around than total variation distance. That part's very easy and mechanical. The second part is really where all of the action is happening, which is we want to efficiently detect in high dimensions where an adversary has hidden corruptions that are throwing us off from the right answer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to combine that and create an algorithm out of this detection approach for detecting when an estimator has been compromised. So this recipe isn't made to make sense right now, but let's walk through it and see how it works in a simple example to understand how you can do robust estimation of the mean and covariance. So the first thing I want to focus on is actually a pretty simple problem to wrap your head around, is the special case that I mentioned, where you're given samples that are epsilon close to a Gaussian, but I'm promising you that the covariance of the distribution is the identity. So your entire goal is to try and find the mean in high dimensions in a way that's robust and tolerant to corruptions that are added. So the first goal is, remember that we want to try and find an estimate mu hat that's close to the true one in total variation distance. After all, that's a way that we can make sure that we're being honest, because the samples we're given are close according to total variation. So if we also require ourselves to be close to the same norm, we can't really be hiding dimension-dependent factors underneath the norms we're choosing. So the basic fact is that you can actually control the total variation distance between two Gaussians rather easily. So if I give you two Gaussians, one has mean mu and the other has mean mu hat, and they both have the identity covariance, A pretty basic fact is that actually the thing that governs the total variation distance is the Euclidean distance between their mean vectors. So if you take mu and mu hat, then really it's half of the Euclidean distance that bounds a total variation distance. This follows from some well-known tools, namely Pinsker's inequality. For those of you who are interested, the way that you prove something like this is that actually the KL divergence between two Gaussians has a really nice closed form. So you can just plug it in this special case, and then use this well-known bound about how having small KL divergence implies that you have small total variation distance. But it really tells us that the corollary of this basic fact is that our problem of robustly estimating the mean according to this total variation distance really boils down to trying to estimate the mean in Euclidean distance without losing any dimension-dependent factors. So we're given something like epsilon close to Gaussian, and we want to estimate mu within epsilon in Euclidean distance. So now I get to really what's the main meat of the talk. This was all just a prelude to this main technical part in the recipe, which is detecting when a naive estimator has been compromised. Remember in the beginning of the talk, I told you about one-dimensional robust estimation, where we were given samples from an unknown Gaussian or an adversary corrupted epsilon fraction, but the empirical mean and the empirical variance didn't work. That was one of the main conceptual messages of robust statistics, was that when the empirical mean and empirical variance don't work because they're too sensitive, there are other things you can do, like the median and median absolute deviation. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to do something even more naive. We know that the empirical mean just doesn't work in the presence of corruptions, but we're going to try to do it anyways. So that's our trick. What we're instead going to do is we're going to try and detect when this naive estimator, which can't always work, has been corrupted. So here's the thought experiment. See, if you take samples from a high-dimensional Gaussian with covariance identity and mean mu, it looks like the points are equally distributed around a ball which has radius root d. So what could the adversary do if he can control an epsilon fraction of the points to really mess you up if you want to use the empirical mean? Well, I'm going to color code this, so the red points are going to be the ones the adversary has corrupted, the black ones are the ones that he hasn't touched. So if he can move an epsilon fraction of the points, he's not going to move the points outside the ball because then it's too easy to detect the fact that he's added those as corrupted points. So instead, he's just going to put his corrupted points on this ball with radius root d. But what he's going to do is he's going to have all the corruptions gang up in one direction so that you move the empirical mean very far away from the true mean. So because those points are root d out from the true mean, even though he only corrupts an epsilon fraction, that's why he can move it by epsilon times root d amount. So this actually tells you a bit about the subtleties. This tells you, for example, where the epsilon times root d guarantees came from. In some of those earlier estimators that I mentioned, they just came from the fact that they weren't able to detect when this type of scenario arose. But it also brings up another subtlety, which is that, see, if I didn't color code these points, and I just showed you the cloud of which points there were without this color coding of black and red based on which things were uncorrupted and which were corrupted, you'd never be able to tell which points you corrupted. When I look at a single one of these points, they're in the right ball, so you'd never be able to tell in isolation whether they're genuine points or they've been added to your data set in a spurious manner. But see, it's the fact that there are many red points, too many, pointing in one particular direction that helps you detect them. Your goal isn't to recover all of the corrupted points. It's just to be able to detect when your empirical mean has been pushed too far away from the true mean. So the key idea is that if we just want to use the empirical mean anyways, then how can we detect that the adversary has messed us up in this way? Is if he's really put all of these red points in some low-dimensional subspace, root d distance out so that he moves our empirical mean a lot, then he's actually going to mess up the variance. Along that direction where all these red points lie, when we project on that direction, we're going to have variance much larger than 1, even though we were promised that the covariance was the identity. So this is the basis for all of the algorithms, as simple as it sounds, is mechanically all of our algorithms are just going to use this, maybe in slightly fancier frameworks, is we're just going to use the naive estimator anyways and detect when so many corruptions have been added that we've lost dimension independence guarantees for robustness. So here's the lemma that actually makes this formal. I'm not going to prove it, but this is the thing that makes it more precise. So if we're in the setup that we're talking about, we're given samples which are epsilon close to a Gaussian with unknown mean, but the covariance is the identity. Then what happens is that if our empirical mean, mu hat, is too far off from the true mean, it's off by more than epsilon times root log 1 over epsilon, then it turns out that our covariance will be off too. If we take the empirical covariance, sigma hat, well, you know, it should be about the identity, but instead, the spectral norm in that difference will be larger than it should be. So really, this is the main takeaway. You don't have to understand all of the technical details of this lemma. It's just that if we try and use the empirical mean anyways, well, then the adversary really can mess us up. But in order to tamper with the empirical mean, there has to be some echo and some evidence of what he's done in the next higher moment, in the second moment in this case. So it turns out that this simple observation is actually enough to get our first robust estimation algorithm. We can detect when a naive estimator is compromised, when the empirical mean is compromised in a dimension-independent way. And now all we're going to do is we're going to leverage this into what I'll call a win-win algorithm. So let me tell you what I mean by that. This will complete our first example of this recipe in action of how to get robust estimation at high dimensions. So the idea is we have, you know, our natural estimator, the empirical mean. Let's try and use it. But the problem is that sometimes the empirical mean really doesn't work. And we know that the empirical mean, when it goes wrong, when mu hat is sufficiently far off from mu, there's some evidence of that tampering in the second moment. So the only question is, when the second moment is off and sigma hat is far from the identity, what do we do now once we know that our estimator was compromised? So the idea is that the only way that we could have sigma hat being off from the identity is if in this direction of largest empirical variance, if the main contributing factor to the variance are actually the corrupted points. Because we know that the uncorrupted points should have variance 1 if there was nothing else added. So the idea is that if we encounter the scenario where our second moment is off from what it should be, all we do is we use the largest singular vector of the covariance, and that's the direction we explore the data in. We project the data on that direction, and then it turns out that there's actually a threshold t that you can compute, which when you throw out the points above it, you're going to throw out more outliers than inliers. So you can't guarantee you're not going to throw out some of the good points too, but the point is every good guy who gets thrown away takes at least one bad guy with him. So either you had the empirical mean was already a good estimator, it was certifiably good because of the second moment, or you're going to detect that your estimator was compromised, and you're going to find a direction in which the distribution looks different than it should have, and you're going to be able to throw out more bad points than good points and purify your sample. So that's the basic idea, is that when you look in that direction and throw out all the points above this threshold t, you're going to throw out more corrupted points than uncorrupted ones. So eventually, you're going to run out of corrupted points. And that's what I mean by a win-win algorithm. You detect when your naive estimator has been compromised, and either you're done because it hasn't been compromised, or you make progress by filtering your samples and actually purifying them so that there are fewer corrupted points in your data set. So eventually, when this process terminates and you just run out of bad points to throw out, what you're left with have to be certifiably good parameters for your original estimation problem. So that's the basic framework, even in the simple case, for estimating the unknown mean. All you're doing is you're combining the simple three-step recipe for how to actually do high-dimensional robust estimation. So I won't get into the details of how to actually analyze this algorithm, but it runs in a pretty good running time, where n is the sample complexity and d is the dimension. And its sample complexity is pretty reasonable as well. Later on, I'll show you some empirical evaluations that show what these things can do in practice. What I want to show you instead, I want to show you one last technical part before we get into some fun experiments to show what robust estimation at high dimensions can actually accomplish. I showed you one example of this recipe in a pretty simple setting where we're trying to estimate the mean. And when we were trying to estimate the mean, we just looked out to the second moment as a way of combining things and creating our win-win algorithm. Now I'm going to tell you actually how much further you can push this general recipe. It turns out you can also use it to find the unknown covariance. And it's interesting to see how just the same basic pattern, but just fancier steps, accomplishes yet another task in robust estimation. This actually is sort of a common framework for a lot of the algorithms that have recently come out in high-dimensional robust estimation. So let me tell you about a more technical case, the unknown covariance. And we're going to see some interesting characters arising here. So remember that once you have this recipe, a lot of it just fills itself in. Remember, in this unknown covariance case, I'm promising you, to make your life simple, that the mean is 0. I'm only going to make your life easier. All you have to do is find a good estimate for sigma. But once again, total variation distance is just a really ugly distance to work with. It's very natural from a robustness standpoint because it means that an adversary is corrupting only, say, 10% of your data. But from an algorithmic standpoint, it's, you still need some other metric that you're working with that's a little bit more tractable and convenient to think about. So once again, we want to find some other parameter distance, which is good enough for our purposes. In the case of the unknown mean, it was the Euclidean distance, which is very natural. In this case, it's funny, it turns out to be a stranger distance. So the basic fact that you use, proved the same way, is that if you have two Gaussians, both with mean 0, sigma is the true covariance, and sigma hat is your estimate. What's the thing that ensures that sigma hat is a good estimate? Is it turns out you can bound the total variation distance by this rather strange expression on the right. So this was proven the same exact way using Pinsker's inequality. And actually, what this, let me explain what this distance is. So it's called the Mahalanobis distance. So its name is equally hard to pronounce to explain why the formula is so complex. But it's actually very natural because if you think about this covariance sigma, if there's some direction of very small variance in my Gaussian, in my original Gaussian, I really better get that direction right. That's exactly what's going on with this formula, is that in some direction where sigma is very small, you get penalized a lot if your estimated covariance is large. So it's really like, for example, in one dimension, it would just be the ratio of the variances, because when one is small, the other had better be small too. This is just a high-dimensional analog of that, but it tells us that our new goal for robust high-dimensional estimation is to work with this kind of strange distance. Is we're given samples that are epsilon close in total variation distance. We want to be able to estimate sigma so well that sigma hat satisfies this inequality. So this distance seems strange, but I promise you it actually is the right one in high dimensions. But now we get to the interesting part. Remember that for the unknown mean, all of the action happened when we just tried to use the empirical mean and we wanted to detect when that had been corrupted. Now something interesting is going to happen here. So in the empirical mean case, what we had to do to detect when our estimator was tampered with was go to the second moment. If we're trying to estimate the second moment, we actually have to go to the fourth moment to detect when it's been tampered with. And that fourth moment is actually going to take us to some pretty interesting mathematical tools involving tensors. So let's just do a thought experiment to try and keep things simple. So let's imagine we're given samples from this Gaussian, n of 0 sigma, so mean 0, covariance sigma. Now, we want to once again use the empirical estimator. So we want to use the naive estimator, the empirical covariance, in order to estimate sigma. So how do we detect when that's been compromised? So here's a sort of key fact, which is really probably one of the last technical things I want to get to before some of the experiments, is actually it turns out that if you take samples from a d-dimensional Gaussian, the fourth moment has a really beautiful structure. So imagine I take samples from this unknown Gaussian, mean 0, unknown covariance. What I can do is I can compute a fourth moment of those samples. So remember, xi is a length d vector. What I can do is I can take that length d vector and tensor it with itself. That creates a length d squared vector. And then I can take its outer product with itself. What that creates is a d squared by d squared matrix, which captures the fourth moments. This is where our action has to be happening. If the second moment is corrupted, if it's wrong, if sigma hat is just not a good estimate for sigma, we have to somehow use this fourth moment to figure out what's gone wrong. Something really interesting happens. It turns out that M has a really beautiful expression. That when you restrict it to the right space, what it looks like, this is a d squared by d squared matrix, it turns out to be, well, you can take sigma and tensor it with itself. That's a d squared by d squared matrix. You get 2 times that. And then you get this funny little expression right here. So this expression, this is a flat symbol. So what you do is you take this d by d matrix sigma and you flatten it. That's why I'm using the flat symbol to a length d squared vector. And you take its outer product with itself. That turns out to be the fourth moment. Now this looks really strange if you've never seen it before. And I'm not going to prove this for you. Instead, I'm just going to say something that's somewhat related to it, that at least you can relate to. So in one dimension, if you take a Gaussian with mean 0 and variance 1, its fourth moment is 3. It turns out that that's because if you take a complete graph on 4 nodes, there are 3 perfect matchings. That's a really pedantic way to say that. In general, there's a very strong connection between perfect matchings and moments of Gaussians that extends beyond the one-dimensional case to the high-dimensional case. And what's really going on here is that this fourth moment is a little bit funny because it's a fourth moment encoded as a matrix. So it's a d squared by d squared thing. So fundamentally, you're taking a d by d by d by d tensor and combining 2 of the dimensions into one side of the matrix. But that acts a little bit funny with the matching because one of the pairs of dimensions is on the same side of the matrix and the other pairs are split across the 2 sides. That corresponds to the fact that sigma influences this fourth moment 3 times, but one of them is in a slightly different way because of the way you flattened what's really going on in the fourth moment. So there's a way to prove this using something called Isserlis's theorem. Sometimes you can also call it Wick's formula. But the key point really is that what's going on here is if I think about this d squared by d squared matrix, well, sigma tensor sigma is something which doesn't have too large a spectral norm, but this guy has a much, much larger spectral norm. That's what actually makes high-dimensional estimation, especially about the variance, so tricky, is that when an adversary hides the corruptions he's making, because this contribution is so much larger than the other one, it's easy to hide in the shadow of this guy. So what actually happens in our algorithm is that we carefully project out that piece, and that way we get another spectral algorithm to detect when the empirical second moment has been compromised. So just to explain how the structure of the algorithm works, the idea is to take your data, so imagine you had some estimate sigma hat. What you can do is you can apply sigma hat to the -1/2. That's a transformation that if that were the true sigma, it would actually transform the data so that the samples were coming from a Gaussian with covariance identity. So all you do is then you form some d squared by d squared matrix and compute some restricted eigenvalues. And what that does is the same type of thing that when those eigenvalues are too large, you detect the fact that your empirical second moment has been compromised using this fourth moment. So the takeaway is actually the same in this recipe, is that once again you try to do something naive. You try the naive plug-in second moment estimator, the empirical variance. And here it's something a bit fancier, is that now you actually need to look at restricted eigenvalues and use tensor methods in order to detect the corruptions in a way that you don't introduce some dimension-dependent error guarantees. So in fact, now I've told you enough that I can actually piece together the entire algorithm, and then we can try applying it. So what if I have these 2 pieces? The one piece being I can robustly estimate the location, and the other one I can robustly estimate the scale. What I claim is we've actually solved our entire problem. So imagine we're given samples that are corrupted, but they come from some Gaussian where I don't know either the mean or the covariance. So this is the fully general problem. Now what you can do is you can actually turn it into the 2 special cases we've studied. See, the first thing you do is you take your samples, you take double the number you want. So you take xi, that's one sample, and another sample, xi prime. When you subtract the 2, that's like a noisy sample from a Gaussian, which has mean 0, because their means cancel each other out. It has double the covariance, not a big deal. Now I can just use my algorithm for robustly estimating the scale to come up with a good estimate for sigma. And I learned sigma hat. And now what I can do is I can put the data in isotropic position. So now I take a bunch of samples and I apply sigma hat to the -1/2. If, for example, this really were sigma, then I'd be getting something which now has the identity covariance as my underlying Gaussian. And because sigma hat is close to sigma, that actually is good enough. So I can apply my algorithm for learning the unknown mean just to this problem, and combining the two, you get an algorithm for the full problem. So given epsilon corrupted samples from a high-dimensional Gaussian, you really can estimate the parameters of the Gaussian in completely dimension-independent error guarantees in polynomial time. So, what I actually want to tell you about is also what you can do experimentally with this, because I have to confess, so the reason that we study this type of problem, how often are you given samples actually from a Gaussian or something close to a Gaussian? Probably never. But this is a proxy for, a lot of other problems which roughly have well-distributed sets of points. I'm going to try and make this point as we go through the experiments. So the first thing I want to do is I want to actually, try out some of the algorithms for robust statistics just in a synthetic setting where I already know what the underlying truth is and see how they compare. How real are these dimension-dependent error guarantees that these algorithms that existed before seem to achieve? So what happens, for example, if I give you samples, actually from a Gaussian, but with 10% noise? So you can take a lot of the standard approaches. RANSAC is a very popular algorithm within the robust statistics community, which all it does is it randomly subsamples the data, computes a good estimate on the subsample data, repeats it many times, and then outputs the best estimate. That's something that works really well in low-dimensional problems, especially regression. But once you go to high dimensions, see what's really going wrong is that things like RANSAC hope that when you subsample the data, you do so in a way that your subsample has no corrupted points. And that just doesn't happen in high-dimensional settings. So if you see this, for example, this RANSAC estimate, then you can measure the error of the estimate to the truth in Euclidean distance. After all, that's the thing that controls total variation distance here. And they have pretty bad performance. So as soon as you go to something even like 100 or 200 dimensions, all of a sudden, even though there's only 10% errors, they're getting something which is off by 1 or 2 in Euclidean distance from the true mean. So that's really far off, and these dimension-dependent factors persist for all of these different algorithms. And yet down here is this new algorithm I gave you for robustly estimating the mean. This little black line where we've zoomed in right here, and we get quite good dimension-independent error guarantees, where it's a constant factor that doesn't get worse as we increase the dimensionality of our problem even into the couple hundreds. Let's try it out for the unknown covariance. So it turns out there's really two different situations for the unknown covariance. One is when the covariance is pretty close to a ball, where it's not too far off from being a ball. That's roughly the isotropic case. That setting, we can do the same experiment. True samples come from a Gaussian, add 10% noise. And you get, once again, these types of error guarantees. So this is the Lai-Rao-Gopala algorithm. This one right here is our algorithm. You can see that that things like RANSAC, once again, have these bad dimension dependence. And this is our error guarantee right down here. And in fact, this works even with very anisotropic data, that we end up getting very good estimates for the covariance that are independent of the dimension. So this is step one of trying to explain why this algorithm is interesting in practice. It's just trying it out in settings where we already know it works. These are situations where 90% of the data really did come from a Gaussian, and the theorems kick in and tell you that you should get dimension-independent guarantees, and moreover that the analysis, which loses the dimension-dependent factors of the other algorithms, really is present. But now I'm going to do something empirical, so I'm going to try out real data and show you a different way to think about what this algorithm is doing. So there's a famous experiment due to November et al., which does the following. So this is going to sound kind of remarkable. I was taken aback when I first saw this one. So what you do is you take genetic data, take a matrix in which the columns are people and the rows are SNPs. So it's just a people by roughly genes matrix. And you take this huge matrix and you take the top two singular vectors. And what you do is you use those singular vectors and you plot people in R2 based on those singular vectors. You project into R2. And you get this beautiful plot right here. So what I've done is I've color-coded it with the country of origin of where the people are from. And in fact, what you get is you get the map of Europe, which is kind of amazing. So, you know, if, for example, you don't have a map of Europe on you, but you have access to some genetic data, you can do this instead. So actually, my point isn't to get into the biology. This is somewhat natural because, you know, what you're doing with principal component analysis, you're looking for the two directions of largest variance. So what ought to be the directions of largest genetic variance? Well, it certainly makes sense to have one of them be thermocline because, you know, things like the average temperature really do drive genetic variation. And the same way, you know, east-west also drives genetic variation because of the inhibitory effects of migrating across those large distances. So this is a really famous experiment. In fact, the title is very elegant. Does genes mirror geography in Europe? Now, I don't want to get into the biology of this, because the truth is there's a lot you can do to tune this experiment to try and get nicer and nicer figures of Europe. Instead, I want to ask the question, you know, can you recover patterns like this in the presence of noise? See, that's actually what robust statistics is designed for. It's designed for being able to try and create good estimates, despite the fact that you don't have utmost confidence that all of your samples are noise-free. This type of thing happens all the time in genetic setups where, for example, you're merging data across different labs, but they're collected in slightly different ways. So if some lab is collecting data in a different way than the others, that might act like outliers because they just follow a different law than the rest of the data you're given. So what I really want to ask is, you know, in one dimension, the fact that we can do robust statistics is great, but let's be honest, you can also eyeball and figure out where those outliers are. You know, especially in that example where I put one outlier out at the very end of the tail, you'd be able to just look at that data and figure out where it is. But in high dimensions, when I put outliers in your data, it's much harder to visualize. So really the question is, can I find these types of patterns that exist, let's say in scientific settings, with algorithms which are provably robust and work in high dimensions? So one thing we can do is we can try out, you know, algorithms that are out there. So if you do PCA, so you know, you set this up so that it has 10% noise. And the way that we set this up to make sure it's fair is that these columns, which are noisy columns, they're like noisy people, well, the norm of those columns is smaller than the norm of the signal. So they're not, you know, far outside the ball of the other points. You can't just pick them off by their norm. And this is what happens with principal component analysis. This is actually very natural because the point is that how you would add the noise is you find some direction, you shoot it off into space, and all of your noise is correlated along this direction. And that's enough to skew the axis, the directions of largest variance, in a way that all of a sudden, you know, I'm an American, so I'm not very good at geography, but I'm pretty sure that's not the map of Europe. So all of a sudden, you can't find this pattern in the data, even though it is there, because 10% of the data really has skewed you badly. You could do ransack, you know, where you subsample and do PCA on it and take the best version of that. And that still produces something a little bit better, but not much better. Now, you can also do things like robust PCA. Robust PCA has many meanings. For example, some of you might be familiar with the Candace et al. Work, in which where you take a matrix and there are sparse corruptions on individual locations in the matrix. That's not quite the right setting here because entire columns are corrupted. It's called a gross corruption model. But there are other you know, semi-definite programs for robust PCA that handle entire columns being corrupted. And for example, one due to Shu, Karamanis, and Sangabi finds this, which is certainly quite a bit better because you can see some of the basic structure. But this is what we're able to find in the presence of noise. It's roughly the same map of Europe. So we did lose Turkey, though. My apologies to Turkey. So Turkey only had 4 people, so I'm still going to call that a win. But the point of this is that even though you added 10% corruptions, the way that you added them was in such a way that there was this direction hiding somewhere out there in high-dimensional space, which when you project the data is really non-Gaussian. And finding that direction efficiently using things like these fourth-order moment techniques that I showed you is actually a smart thing to do, is looking for directions where the data is non-Gaussian tend to be interesting and tend to be places where your outliers are really skewing your results. So one way, and just to explain a bit more how this, how we set this up, see, genetic data is not at all Gaussian. So what we're doing is we're pretending it's Gaussian anyways. We're taking our algorithm for robustly learning a Gaussian in high dimensions and applying it here, and learning its covariance sigma hat, and then taking that sigma hat and taking its top two singular vectors, so the directions of largest genetic variance, and then using that as the projection. So that's the mechanism. So, my point is that actually this happens a lot, especially, I'm a theoretical computer scientist, that a lot of these problems we study, things like computing the Tukey median, the reason they're hard is in a worst case sense, because what they mean when they say the problem is hard is that an adversary can set up your entire problem for you, the inliers and the outliers, in a way that you can't compute the Tukey median. But the way we've set it up is that the adversary doesn't control this 90% of your data. That's stuff which is well distributed. For example, is well distributed around the ball, which, the Gaussian lives, and the rest of it your adversary can mess with. So this is an interesting way to try and go beneath worst case analysis, but we're thinking about this model of trying to robustly learn a Gaussian as just a proxy for a richer problem of trying to work with not adversarially distributed data sets, things like this genetic example. So, let me take a step back and sort of tell you about where I hope some of this will go. Is that, as I mentioned, this latter experiment, the synthetic ones, those were in situations where, well, it really did meet our assumptions that 90% of the data came from a Gaussian. So those experiments just told us that the theorem was correct, that our algorithm was doing what it was proven to do. But this latter experiment shows you that even algorithms created in this idealized model for robustly estimating a Gaussian can have interesting implications for exploratory data analysis. This is what robust statistics was first designed to do, that if you could compute the Tukey median, that would be a great way to create a summary of some clouded points. But instead, for example, estimating the mean as if it were, a Gaussian, well, that's one surrogate for trying to compute the Tukey median, which all of a sudden allows us to really probe these high-dimensional data sets and say something interesting. And I think really, now that there are problems in high-dimensional robust estimation that you can solve algorithmically, I think this is what robust statistics would have been doing. So I think this is a sort of interesting development. I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the work that's happened afterwards. But now that we know that some things are possible, the name of the game is to go out there and figure out what else we can do, both theoretically and empirically with these types of algorithms. All right, so this is a tutorial, so I'm going to cover some of the more recent works on this, but I'm just going to tell you some of the main theorems here. And I put this at the end of part one just so that you're not too exhausted. So let me tell you what else is known in this high-dimensional robust estimation context. So one interesting development is actually, there are some lower bounds to robust estimation that tell you some things you can't do. So remember that the error guarantees we had, what was nice about them, well, they were doable by polynomial time algorithms, awesome. And they were dimension independent. They got O of epsilon times some polylog whatever epsilon. But remember, things like the Tukey median, those things get O of epsilon without any extra logarithmic terms. So there's still some room in here whether or not we can get even better robust estimators in high dimensions, when we can remove this logarithmic dependence on epsilon, which might or might not be necessary. It turns out there's some limitations to doing that. So there's a very powerful family of algorithms called statistical Corey algorithms. What these are, see, in algorithms, you can't really prove lower bounds against general algorithms. That's a whole other spiel for another day, what makes that difficult from a computational complexity perspective. But instead of the name of the game in lower bounds is to somehow blindfold your algorithms so that they do only some restricted things. Statistical query models, well, they restrict to a very natural set of things. So instead of actually seeing the samples from your distribution that's close to a Gaussian, what you instead do is you're allowed to make queries to the samples. And that's how you learn some partial information about them. So in statistical query models, what you do is you take a function which is bounded, so it only takes values in the range 0 to 1. And what you do is you query that function, and then someone tells you some estimate of the mean of that function. How well do they estimate the mean of that function is up to sampling. So that's the model for statistical queries, that you don't actually see the samples. Instead, you interact with the data through statistical queries about its properties. It turns out that the algorithms I described are statistical query algorithms because they use simple things like the moments of the distribution. So they work in this framework, but it turns out that this framework can't get you down to O of epsilon. That in fact, any statistical query learning algorithm in the strong corruption model, where they're both insertions and deletions, can't beat this barrier of epsilon times root log whatever epsilon. This really comes from the fact that an adversary can remove part of the tail of the Gaussian, and you can't easily detect that he's done that and fill in the rest of the tail. So if it makes error little o of epsilon root log over epsilon, then it actually has to make a super polynomial number of orders. So this is some kind of limitation to high-dimensional robust estimation. Even though you can prune away those root d factors, there are these extra polylog 1 over epsilon factors that seem somewhat intrinsic. So there are actually some other generalizations in some interesting directions. See, the problem that I started off at the outset was you're given samples from a Gaussian, but an adversary corrupts an epsilon fraction of it however he wants. Now, so far we've been thinking about epsilon as being not too large, something like 10%. It turns out there's actually some interesting theory to what happens if you make epsilon larger than that. Even if you allow an adversary to corrupt 90% of your samples. So this sounds a bit strange, right? Because if an adversary can corrupt 90% of your samples, why can't you take your Gaussian and create another Gaussian? And you just can't tell which one was the true one at all. So the catch, that really is a catch to this, but instead what you do is you weaken the guarantee. So there's something within, actually, coding theory called list decoding, which this is an analog of. Instead of trying to output just one hypothesis, you allow your algorithm to output more than one hypothesis. So in that case where the adversary creates some other dummy Gaussian, you would just output their two means, and at least one of those two would be close to the true mean you were looking for to begin with. So in general, Charikar, Steinhardt, and Valiant showed that when given samples from a distribution of mean mu and bounded covariance, that you can output a list mu hat 1 through mu hat L, which has the property that the list isn't too large. So think about, think about 1 minus alpha being like 90% or something like that. And it has the property that whatever the true mean mu is, there's at least one element of your list that's close. So this is a list decoding guarantee that even when an adversary can corrupt 90% of your data, you can spit out a list of 10 hypotheses with the promise that at least one of those is close to the true answer. What's nice about this is that actually straightforwardly extends to things like mixture models. So if instead I had a mixture of two Gaussians, the idea is that when I allow corruptions, I can think about estimating one of the components. That's one instance of this problem because the noise and the other component together are all of the other noise. And same with the other component. So what's nice is that this then extends to a lot of other problems in this cool manner. And you can ask all sorts of other questions because really the name of the game is what we know to be true in high-dimensional estimation. Now what can we do robustly and provably? So you can ask other questions like, we know, for example, in high-dimensional estimation, that sparsity plays a major role in reducing the sample complexity. So what happens when you combine sparsity and robustness? So some work of Lee, Du, Balakrishnan, and Singh showed that actually in the case where you're trying to estimate the unknown mean mu, but you're promised that it's actually sparse, that it's k-sparse, you can do much better. So you can once again get some dimension-independent robustness guarantees. Your epsilon times root log whenever epsilon closed. But now the number of samples depends only logarithmically on d, and is now k squared, where k is the sparsity. So you get some gains in terms of the overall sample complexity by combining sparsity with robustness in high dimensions. And Lee also studied robust sparse PCA. And one interesting question, although there are SQL lower bounds for this, so maybe the answer is no, is you'll notice that the sample complexity here is k squared times log d. But for a lot of problems where you have k-sparse vectors, things like compressed sensing, a lot of times you end up with k log d. So is it the case that robustness and having small sample complexity and efficient running time are at odds with each other? So is this a new type of tension between these three different players in the setting? All right, so I'm basically wrapping up. So we had, I told you about how some of these algorithms are actually more practical than they seem, despite the fact that I use things like Isserles's theorem and perfect matchings of Gaussian moments, that these things really can do interesting things in exploratory data analysis. And one last question I want to leave you with is, the fact that you can do high-dimensional robust estimation for a Gaussian is something that really surprised me personally. So I mentioned that in theoretical computer science it would be called proper agnostic learning. Now, agnostic learning has a long and storied history. In this setting, we're talking about it in an unsupervised setting because you want to estimate the parameters of your distribution. But there's a lot of work in supervised settings, things like trying to learn a linear separator in the presence of noise. And unfortunately, those problems in high dimensions turn out to be very, very difficult. That not only do they seem to be hard, entire cryptographic schemes are based on the assumption that you can't actually solve those problems. So I think, now that we do know some problems that really can be solved, which are robust estimation problems in high dimensions, it begs the question, well, what else can be done? Especially using these types of techniques like this recipe I laid out for you, about using spectral techniques to detect when naive estimators have been compromised. So, this is completely wide open. I encourage you to go out and solve some of these problems, and also try out some of these estimators on data sets and see what provably robust estimators have to offer to different problems you're interested in. So I'll wrap up the first part of this talk and give you the quick summary of what I hope you got out of the talk, was that we studied a very concrete problem, which was trying to learn a high-dimensional Gaussian in the presence of corruptions. So what we wanted dimension-independent error bounds. Instead of having your input be epsilon close to a Gaussian and only having your output be epsilon times root d close, we wanted roughly epsilon error. So we wanted dimension-independent error bounds for robustly learning a Gaussian. And moreover, we gave a general recipe for how to go about designing high-dimensional, robust, and computationally efficient estimators using restricted eigenvalue problems as a way to detect when your naive estimator has been compromised. I also told you about some of the more recent work that's a follow-on to this line. Things like SQL lower bounds for getting down to O epsilon error. Things like handling more errors, even more than 50% errors. And also sparse robust estimation and how sparsity interacts with robustness in high-dimensional settings. And really what I was trying to get at was this question about, empirically, when you try out a lot of the approaches in robust statistics, they really don't work in dimension, let's say 6 and higher. So all of a sudden, when you can do some things, I wonder, whether practical robust statistics is within reach. So I'm going to stop here, but I'll mention that the second part of this tutorial will be a slightly different take on robustness. As I started off by saying robustness can mean many things to many people, this part of the talk was robustness means algorithms. So actually getting algorithms that are provably robust. What I want to do in the second half of the talk is turn it on its head and see what different models of robustness have to teach us about the algorithms that we know and love. All right, so I'll stop there, and so thanks for your attention, and we'll take a 10-minute break before we start the second half.
辉哥嘞？辉哥嘞？
有点后悔还挺正常。
嗯？这个还是没有。没有，我看大家都走。哪个是吗？这里不在。哦，这个。做出茶，我靠！我这个来是Robustness。
咱们其实有点复杂，但是这个水平之高，它跟这个方而且从分布学基本上感觉高端了。可以直接看一下。6点啊，别忘了啊！一会儿弄完以后，咱们在那个哪儿接个干物，是那个运动一块儿去那个包肉。
去哪里？
我跟老板也要去。5楼的包肉。一会儿在那个群里面发啊。
Reception, yeah. I'm sure there is. Well, 2 days ago, but it's actually nice. And then I see yesterday to try and come up to so running, so it's pretty. You go by a set photo. Okay, it's about that. So privacy. Yeah. Privacy. Issues like that. Where do you know who you in the
Very tight.
Where were you sitting?
It works better than
Break.
All right, let's get started. Okay, so remember the first part of this talk I told you about how to do some interesting things algorithmically with robustness and high dimensions. So as I promised, the second part of this talk is going to be turning this idea on its head. So instead of trying to get algorithms for provable robustness, what we're going to do is we're going to take some algorithms that we know and love for a problem called community detection, and I'm going to introduce some interesting models to study their robustness and qualitative properties about what they do and don't achieve. And, you know, really the theme you should think about in this is exactly like the title says. What does robustness say about algorithms? But really one of the points I want to get across is that there is no one right notion of robustness. And actually playing with different notions gives us different axes on which to compare algorithms. So, you know, this first part will also be, you know, the first part of this part of the talk will also be a story, the same way that the first part of the last talk was a story about estimating the parameters of a Gaussian. This one is going to be a story about a tension between something that we know and love in statistics, sharp thresholds, and notions of robustness. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a problem which has, you know, gained a lot of attention recently. It's called the stochastic block model. Sometimes we'll also hear it referred to as community detection. Which roughly the goal is, you know, you're given a graph, you want to try and find well-connected sets of nodes. And one way that this problem is often studied is in a generative model where there is some planted community structure. So let me explain what the stochastic block model is. This model is old and dates back more than 30 years to Holland, Lasky, and Weinberg. And the idea is you're going to generate a random graph as follows. You start off with some hidden partition of the graph into k different communities. Here I've depicted it using 3 different communities of red, blue, and green color. So every node has one of these hidden colors. This is the planted community structure. Now what happens is you use this community structure to generate a random graph. So what you have underneath the model is a k by k matrix of connection probabilities. So for example, the entry in row 2, column 1 represents the probability that for a given pair of nodes, one of them belongs to the red community, and the other belongs to the blue community, that they're connected by an edge. And this matrix is symmetric, so you see Q12 in this second row first column and first row second column. So all you do is there's this planted community structure, and then you sample edges independently according to this matrix of connection probabilities. So this is a random graph model. In fact, what it does is it generates some graph, which if you set up these connection probabilities right, the nodes within a community will be better connected to each other than they are to the rest of the graph. So this is a very simple and ubiquitous model. In fact, it's been studied across a really broad range of fields. So it started off in statistics and then was studied in computer science as an average case model for studying things like planted dissections. And more recently, it's been adopted within the information theory and statistical physics communities, where once again, each of these communities has given rise to different types of algorithms. So this basic problem, when your goal is given the graph to try and recover the underlying community structure from which it was generated, well, there actually turn out to be an awful lot of algorithms that do the trick. So there are simple combinatorial methods based on something as naive as degree counting. We're going to see one of those later, where if you want to figure out whether a pair of nodes belong to the same community or not, all you do is you count the number of common neighbors they have. There are simple combinatorial methods going back to the work of Hui et al., which provably work. There are fancier things like spectral methods, where what you do is you take your matrix, and you, on n nodes, and you take your graph on n nodes, and you turn it into an n by n matrix, and then you take the top k singular vectors, and those k singular vectors will reveal the planted community structure. There are also approaches based on MCMC, due to, for example, Jerem and Sorkin. I won't get into those. And there are, for example, semi-definite programs as well. And these algorithms all succeed in some range of parameters, depending on the connection probabilities of your underlying model. They do and don't work. But really, recently, there's been this focus on trying to reach sharp thresholds for the model. So can we have algorithms that not just succeed in some range of parameters, but succeed down to the fundamental limits of where it is and isn't possible to recover the underlying community structure? So the first part of the story is really a story about surprising success of some of the tools from statistical physics and the sharp predictions that they create. So in fact, the easiest place to study this problem, let's make it even simpler. So instead of having k communities, we're going to start off with 2 communities. And they're going to be equal size. We have n over 2 blue nodes and n over 2 red nodes. And all we're going to do is we're going to have 2 parameters a and b, so that every pair of nodes that belongs to the same community connects with probability a over n. And every pair of nodes that belongs to different communities connects with probability b over n. And so what we want to do is we want to try and recover this underlying graph structure. And really the operative regime where statistical physicists study this type of problem is when you think about a and b as being constants. So the way to think about that is if if this edge has probability a over n, then really, if a and b are constants, then the average degree of the graph is a constant. So they do this because empirically, a lot of realistic graph models do actually have constant average degree. Now there's one technicality I want to get into when we talk about recovering from community detection. So if you think about a and b as being constants, well then, every node has constant average degree, which means that there's actually some chance that a node isn't connected to anything else in the graph. That's just a fact of life, or more precisely, the degree of each node, if you work out the random variable, it's a Poisson random variable with expectation a over 2 plus b over 2. It's not so important for this talk. The important thing is that this really means there's a large fraction of nodes that are isolated in this graph, and you could never figure out whether they're red or blue because there's just no information there. They're not connected to anything else. So instead, what people usually study for this is something called partial recovery. This is a little bit weaker than you might have thought the problem would be at the outset. The goal is you're given a sample from this graph, and what you want to do is you just want to find a partition of the graph into 2 pieces so that it's correlated with the true community structure, so that one of the pieces of your partition has, say, more than half, has like 3/4 blue nodes, and the other one has 3/4 red nodes. So you just want to beat random guessing for your bisection in this graph, and that's called partial recovery. We want to find a partition that has agreement better than a half with the underlying community structure. So the rest of the talk, this is what I'll mean when I say solves the community detection problem. So in fact, Dessel et al. Made this incredibly striking conjecture, which said that partial recovery should be possible in this simple stochastic block model if and only if a minus b squared is strictly larger than 2a plus b. there's no hidden constants even in it. So this is a really strong conjecture. And this conjecture, is very sharp, so this will be the first part of the talk, is the tension between the sharpness and what this means for robustness. But first I want to tell you a little bit about where this conjecture comes from. It comes from techniques that are certainly not as familiar to me and maybe not to some of you. It's based on belief propagation and about the fixed points of belief propagation. So what is belief propagation? It's a powerful technique which was introduced by Judea Pearl over 30 years ago, which is an iterative way for creating algorithms based on simple probabilistic reasoning. So I'm not going to explain what belief propagation is in full generality, but let me explain what it means in the context of community detection. So all that's going to happen is at any point in time, every node is going to have some beliefs. In this case, it'll just be the beliefs for this node, the probability he thinks he's in community 1 or in community 2, that he's red or blue. And all that's going to happen is you're just iteratively going to broadcast your beliefs to everyone else on the graph, listen to what everyone else is saying, and then update your beliefs and keep repeating. This is what I mean by an iterative algorithm for causal reasoning. So all you do is, node U collects messages from all the other nodes. See, if he gets a message from node V, V's really confident he's a blue node, well, the fact that he's missing an edge, that there's no edge between U and V, means that U's going to update his beliefs to say, maybe I'm a bit more likely to be red because V is so confident he's blue. So there's a precise way to do this, and all you do is you keep updating your beliefs in a Bayesian way, and then broadcasting your new beliefs out onto the world. This is belief propagation. It's a very simple and ubiquitous algorithm that applies in all sorts of probabilistic settings. And where the sharp conjecture came from is kind of an amazing sequence of chains of hopeful statements. So see, belief propagation, there's always this technicality that there's a trivial fixed point to belief propagation, where if you started off at that fixed point, you would just get stuck and you would never make any progress. This trivial fixed point is, what if node U had the belief that he was half likely to be red and half likely to be blue, and all the other nodes also had the same belief. So the problem is that what this really corresponds to is no one knows anything, right? And so if you take belief propagation where you iteratively update your beliefs, and I start off as node U and I'm thinking I know nothing, and I listen to a whole bunch of other nodes who tell me they don't know anything either, I still say I don't know anything. So this is the trivial fixed point for belief propagation. If you start off at all half, you just get stuck there and you never move. That happens regardless. But what turns out to be true is that when A minus B squared is larger than 2A plus B, this one trivial fixed point actually becomes unstable. So you can do a local analysis of this fixed point and show that any slight perturbation around it will all of a sudden take you away from it. So the hope was that, this is the chain of reasoning that went into this prediction, is that belief propagation is among all algorithms the optimal algorithm. And when A minus B squared is less than or equal to 2A plus B, belief propagation gets stuck. So that must be because the problem is just information theoretically impossible, and the problem can't be solved. And the other part of the hope was that when A minus B squared is larger than 2A plus B, that belief propagation doesn't get stuck there, so hence whatever it reaches eventually in this iterative procedure must solve partial recovery. So this was a really strong chain of reasoning that was really starting from this hope that belief propagation is, in some sense, an optimal algorithm. That when it fails, it means the problem is just information theoretically impossible, and that otherwise it succeeds, even though it's a very complicated iterative scheme. So what's amazing is that this conjecture is true, down to the exact constant. So in some really remarkable work of Mossel, Lehman, and Sly, and independently by Masuli, they showed that actually this conjecture is just completely sharp and true, that in this community detection problem with two communities with probability A over n and B over n, it's possible to find a partition that's correlated with the true community structure if and only if A minus B squared is strictly larger than 2A plus B. And what really got me thinking about this problem, now we're going to start getting into issues about robustness. And I'm a theoretical computer scientist, and this belief propagation approach is very different than the usual algorithms we try out. If you give me an algorithmic problem, one of my first things I would try out is I would try out things like semi-definite programs or other convex programs. And this approach based on belief propagation is wildly on the other end of the spectrum. It's some iterative approach for solving some non-convex optimization problem. And it gets all the way down to the fundamental limits of the problem, so that when it fails, the problem is just information theoretically possible. And yet, on the other hand, if you tried out semi-definite programs, they do work. They succeed when a minus b squared is larger than c times a plus b. So in some range of parameters, but they don't get exactly down to the same constant too. So what's going on here? This, at least for me, was a great cause to have some philosophical pangs about what's going on. So maybe non-convex methods, things like belief propagation, are just fundamentally better algorithms than convex approaches. Maybe every algorithms designer should learn a bunch of these techniques, and honestly, maybe they should. But it certainly raises this philosophical question. And it also raises another question, which I'm also quite interested in, which is, on the one hand, increasingly, as we study these statistical problems, we have different worlds colliding. So in the first part of this talk, it was about what happens when algorithm design collides with robust statistics, and what's possible in high-dimensional robust estimation. Here we have a different pair of worlds colliding. We have theoretical computer science and statistical physics. They have some frameworks for making predictions based on belief propagation. And we have our own based on things like semi-definite programs and integrality gaps. But what happens when we study the same problems and our predictions seem different? Who's right and who's wrong? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a spoiler that the answer to these questions will be based on robustness. That actually, I'm going to use robustness to show how these questions can change meaning depending on slight changes in the model. So this is more of a philosophical talk about robustness has to teach us about some of the algorithms that we know and love. So let me introduce another key player in this talk, which is something really beautiful that I think deserves to be known much more broadly than it is. These are called semi-random models. They're going to sound very innocuous, but these are one way of studying things like robustness. You have something like the stochastic block model, which is this average case model, but it's really brittle in the types of things it constructs. In the same way when you take an Erdos-Rényi random graph, the distribution of different subgraphs is a really rigid thing. You know exactly what it is a priori, and it doesn't deviate much. Well, semi-random models are a way to add some deviation to these random graph models that actually make things a little bit more difficult for algorithms. So they were introduced by Blum and Spencer, and the version I'll be talking about was really refined in some beautiful work of Feig and Killian. So they're just going to be a modification to the usual framework for the stochastic block model. The first step is the same. You start off with some underlying partition that you'd like to recover. So in our case, it's a partition of the graph into two communities, one red, one blue. And we sample edges according to this matrix of connection probabilities so that the nodes within a community are better connected to each other than they are to the rest of the graph. But now comes the twist. An adversary can make changes. That's not surprising. Of course, we're studying things like robustness, and we allow our adversary to change the model. But what's kind of cool about this model is that this adversary is going to sound like he's making your life easier, not harder. So in fact, this adversary is what we often call a monotone adversary. So he's only allowed to add edges within a community and delete edges crossing a community. So you can do things like this, adding an edge within the blue community, and deleting an edge between the blue and red communities. So your original goal in the stochastic block model was that was an average case model, where your goal was to try and recover a community structure where this set of nodes is better connected to each other than they are to the rest of the graph. And what's this adversary doing? He's just making those connections within a community even stronger and destroying some of the connections between the two communities. So this adversary sounds like he's quite helpful. It sounds like it should just make things easier. But the key point is that these semi-random models, even though they sound like a pretty innocuous way to study deviations to the model, because they're only monotone deviations, Well, what they're really doing is they're preventing an algorithm from over-tuning to one particular distribution. Because actually a lot of the local structure, like the degree distribution on the graph, all of a sudden can be different. So let me show you what I mean by this. So let's start off with a really simple, naive, non-robust algorithm. In some pretty boring case of the stochastic block model, but let's study it anyways, just to understand what these semi-random models do. So imagine we had this type of stochastic block model. We've got our graph partitioned into two communities, blue and red. And every edge within the blue community or within the red community appears with probability half. Every edge between the two communities appears with probability 1/4. So there's a really simple algorithm in this dense setting for determining whether two nodes are in the same or different communities. What you can do is literally just count how many neighbors they have in common. So if I take two nodes from the same community, let's pretend they're both from the blue community, and I count how many other nodes share an edge to both of those two nodes, well then, if that extra node comes from the same community, he's also blue, then each of those edges appears with half probability, so we get this contribution. And if instead that other node comes from the red community, we get both of the edges with probability 1/4. So this is the expected number of neighbors in common if the two nodes belong to the same community. And this is the calculation if the nodes belong to a different community. If one of the nodes is red and one is blue, then any other node we choose in the graph has probability half times 1/4 of being connected to both of them. The only thing that's important about these numbers is that the top one is definitely larger than the bottom one. So this is a really simple, naive degree counting algorithm, which has the property that if you just use the simple test, you're going to figure out with high probability which pairs of nodes belong to the same community and which ones belong to different communities. But this algorithm goes completely wrong once you allow a semi-random adversary. So once an adversary is allowed to add edges within a community, let's say, so what he can do is he can bump up the connection probabilities in this red community to being 1. Now, all of a sudden, nodes from the blue community have this probability of being connected. It's exactly the same as it was before. But now, nodes from different communities actually have a larger chance. Because when we have, for example, one red and one blue node, whenever we choose another node being red, now all of a sudden, one of those edges is already there, and we only have 1 times 1/4. So all of a sudden, this expected number of neighbors in common goes up. So this is one simple example of a pretty dumb algorithm, degree counting, which breaks with a monotone adversary. Even though the changes are helpful, it breaks the simple algorithm. Of course, you can see that this problem isn't actually hard. If I gave you an instance of this problem, where I bumped up the connection probabilities in the red community to 1, it's really easy to pick out where the red community is. So, but now I can get to one of the main points, is that actually it turns out that this monotone adversary, for all sorts of algorithms you try out, even less naive ones, things like spectral approaches and that long list of approaches I gave you earlier, things like belief propagation, well, this monotone change can really break, almost all of those algorithms. So it's breaking not only the dumb algorithm, but even these very clever algorithms people have cooked up to get all the way down to the fundamental limits of the problem. But now I can tell you about this actually really interesting and surprising or not surprising fact, that actually there's an inherent tension between sharpness, getting down to precise information theoretic limits, and robustness of the algorithms that accomplish that task. So it turns out that this is really a fundamental tension, that it turns out that when you allow monotone changes, so even though these changes are helpful and they're strengthening ties within a community, and they're breaking ties across it, there's some choice of a monotone adversary that can make the problem information theoretically harder. So before, the problem was possible if and only if a minus b squared is larger than 2a plus b. But now it turns out that there's a constant that's actually larger than 2, that the problem is still information theoretically impossible, even if a minus b squared is less than or equal to c times a plus b. So in fact, this monotone adversary that sounds like he's helping you not only destroys particular algorithms like degree counting, but it actually destroys the guarantees of any algorithm that reaches the information theoretic threshold. Because once you allow monotone changes, the information threading threshold moves. So this is, as I warned you, this will be a little bit more of a philosophical talk about robustness. But one of the cool things, at least a partial answer to the question we had before about how things like non-convex methods compare to convex ones, is thankfully that they're incomparable. Non-convex methods definitely get down to these information threading thresholds in a way that SDPs have not been able to. But it turns out that SDP's one advantage is that the usual way of analyzing them continues to work in the semi-random model. Because what they're looking for is a good bisection of the graph, it turns out that in a lot of cases, once they find some good correlated answer with a true structure, they continue to find it even with these monotone changes. So what this really begs the questions, this tells us a little bit about how to compare these two different families of algorithms. And on the one hand, when you look at them just in an average case model like the stochastic block model, it can sound like the non-convex approaches like belief propagation are strictly better. They run faster and they work all the way down to the type threshold. But as soon as you perturb the model, even in ways that sound like they make the problem easier, like these monotone changes, all of a sudden these algorithms become incomparable. So one of the main messages of this talk is to try and find perturbations in the model and tell you what, and explore what they teach us about the algorithms we're working with to begin with. So, the other message that I want to get across in this talk, which, will happen when I get into some of the details here, is that we know that being robust can make this problem strictly harder. That's what happens when you move this information threading threshold. But, why should that be the case? At first it sounds surprising because these changes sound like they're helpful. But what I really want to get across is that reaching these sharp thresholds for community detection, or in general, having algorithms that work in average case models, well, sometimes these things exploit the structure of the noise in rather fundamental ways. So reaching the sharp threshold of a minus b squared is less than or equal to 2a plus b is really not only about exploiting the structure of the signal, about where the graph is well connected inside compared to outside, but also the precise distribution on the noise about how often red and blue nodes are connected with each other. So let me actually start off with an even simpler problem. So before we even get to community detection, I want to explain some of the intuition about why there ought to be this kind of tension between sharpness and robustness. So let's work with an even simpler model, which is a precursor in a lot of senses to the stochastic block model. So it's a model on trees, which actually has its origins in population genetics. It's called the broadcast tree model. It actually has the distinction of being maybe the first model in this vein of things with a really sharp threshold. I'll tell you about the model and that sharp threshold. So what is the broadcast tree model? It's another recovery problem in the same spirit as community detection. The idea is you start off with some root node that's colored either red or blue. And then what you do is you have some sort of noisy broadcast procedure about how this color gets transmitted to its descendants. So each red node gives birth to some random variable, Poisson of A over 2 nodes of the same color, and a Poisson of B over 2 nodes of the opposite color. So here, for example, this might look like the next level, where this root red node has given birth to 2 red descendants and 1 blue descendant. And then all you do is you iterate this process where every node gives birth to some random number of children of different colors. And in this way, you create some sort of random tree that emanated from this one root node that's either red or blue. So your goal at the end of the day is you're given just the topology of the tree and the colors of these nodes. See, where this is related to population genetics is a lot of times what you do is you use this underlying tree as a model for the tree of life. So all the species that ever lived, how did they relate to each other? Where were their speciation events? And these bottom leaves right here are, for example, the currently existing species, which you can sequence. And the other ones, you might just know the topology of the tree, but you want to build up some knowledge about what their genetic profile was. In any case, the goal of this simple model is if I give you the topology of the tree, along with the colors of the nodes, what you want to do is you want to try and invert the process and guess the color of the root node. Now, the same way in community detection, we wanted to get a community structure that's correlated non-trivially with the true one, that agrees with it better than 50-50. The goal here is to try and guess the color of the root with better than 50% chance. So that's the goal, is we want to understand for what values of A and B, is it possible to guess the color of the root better than 50-50 guessing independently of how many levels we take in this random process. So this is actually a very natural analog for partial recovery, as I mentioned. And, as I mentioned, the real question here is for what values of A and B can we hope to solve this recovery problem? This is another very basic statistical inference problem, which once again actually has sharp thresholds. So there's a very famous threshold in statistics called the Keston-Stigam, which informally what it tells us is for this problem on this broadcast tree model, that the best way to recover the root color is a simple majority vote of the children, of the leaves. So more precisely what this tells us, so back in '66, so over 50 years ago, Keston and Stigam showed that when A minus B squared is larger than 2A plus B, boy that looks familiar, then majority vote succeeds with better than 50-50 chance. So in fact, the Keston-Stigam proof was actually more general than this. It was about more than just majority. In general, when you have some sort of decision rule on this type of random process, well, what you end up getting is something called a multi-type branching process, and what Keston and Stigam really did was they proved a limit theorem for multi-type branching processes. That when this relation between A and B holds, the multi-type branching process you get starting off from red is distinct from the one that you get starting off in blue, but they have very little statistical overlap, and that you can distinguish them. And that otherwise, when this condition between A and B is not met, that they almost entirely overlap, and hence you can't figure out just from majority vote which one is which. It actually took quite a few more years after that to prove that not only do these simple decision rules that take majority or plurality fail, but in fact the problem is just fundamentally impossible. So it's a beautiful work of Evans et al. Showed that actually whenever A minus B squared is less than or equal to 2A plus B, the problem is information theoretically impossible to solve with better than 50-50 guessing. It was based on some information theoretic arguments about the mutual information between the leaves and the root node, which I won't get into. And how this is related, just to make sure that you have the overall picture in mind, is that the broadcast tree model is like a local view of the stochastic block model. So if I were to take the stochastic block model, this random graph model, well, random graphs locally look like trees. That's exactly where the broadcast tree model comes in. If I were to give you just some neighborhood within like the stochastic block model, and I reveal to you on the boundary the colors of those nodes, then I would get exactly this broadcast tree model. That's exactly why these thresholds coincide. Is actually the thresholds for community detection emanate from this so-called Keston-Stigam bound, which is really about the tightness of one particular reconstruction, or majority reconstruction. But as you might be able to guess, what I'm getting at here is, once again, we have a sharp threshold which prescribes for us that if you want to solve a recovery problem on a tree, you ought to use majority reconstruction. But actually what I'm going to tell you is something about how majority reconstruction and fundamentally this Keston-Stigam bound is very dependent on the model. It depends not only on the structure of the signal, but also the precise assumption about the distribution on the noise. And then as soon as you start adding helpful changes, once again, you can move these information theoretic thresholds, and problems that were possible become impossible. So let me show you, for example, how things like majority break once you add some element of seemingly helpful changes. So the first thing, remember, in the community detection problem, we had this notion of a semi-random model. This was our helpful adversary who only made the connections within a community stronger and the connections between them weaker. So here we have to define some notion of a semi-random adversary on a tree now. And what I'll do, just to keep things simple, there are many possible ways you can define this, but this one is the easiest to wrap your head around, is that what we're going to do is we're going to allow a semi-random adversary to make cuts between edges where there's a color change. That's the analog of cutting edges across two community structures. So for example, if I observed this type of broadcast tree model, well, this edge right here alternates between red and blue. So you can cut that edge, and all of a sudden that subtree disappears from our local view, for example, in the stochastic block model. So he excises that tree out of this picture. So these are the changes that he's allowed to make, because he's allowed to cut edges that alternate. And the rough analogy you should have in mind, although the stochastic block model is much more difficult to work with, is that it's kind of like cutting edges between communities and changing this local neighborhood. So maybe the first question we should ask, much the same way we had naive degree counting for the stochastic block model, and these helpful changes destroyed that really brittle algorithm, we can ask what happens to majority. So if majority is the champion algorithm that achieves the Keston-Stigov bound, which we know to be tight, after decades of work within statistics, well, does majority fall victim to the semi-random adversary? So the key observation is actually pretty simple. These things, once you think about them in the right way, are pretty obvious that these types of changes really can move the thresholds. But the key observation is that when you take this type of broadcast tree model, well, some node, it has a good chance that its descendants vote the opposite way that it would have voted. So for example, this is one example right here, this blue node. He gives rise to more red nodes than blue nodes. That can happen, it's an accident. And ultimately, that gives birth to more red leaves within the subtree than there are blue nodes. So his subtree votes the correct way, even though he would have voted the wrong way himself. The same thing happens in this other subtree, that this blue node would have voted one way, but his descendants vote the correct way just by sheer accident. So the key point is that actually near the Keston-Stigov bound, all of a sudden this starts happening everywhere in the tree. That being able to still recover the root with probability better than 50-50 is really about exploiting this phenomenon exactly as often as the probabilistic model posits it happens. Once you tie your hands and you're not allowed to exploit this phenomenon, all of a sudden the sharp threshold moves, and things that were possible, like majority reconstruction, go out the window. So by cutting these edges, the adversary can actually usually flip majority vote near the Keston-Stigov bound. So this, much the same way actually breaks majority reconstruction, the same way that we started off with naive degree counting. When you give me your algorithm, it's pretty easy for me to see the ways that you're over-tuning and come up with these helpful changes that break it. But we have the same type of question that we want to break not just one algorithm, but all of them. All of the things that actually meet this information during threshold. So this is a sort of technical slide. I'm not going to get into the details, but this is roughly the architecture of the proof. So what's really subtle about this is that just because you can cut an edge between two alternating sides doesn't mean you should always do it. Because what becomes nasty about this is, if I cut every subtree where this happens, where the leaves vote the opposite way, it's going to destroy all of the stochastic properties about the model that made it very elegant. See, if I had a red node right here, I know its parent is red. That actually means that its descendant is more likely to be red than blue. Because if it were blue, there was some chance that it would give birth to more red nodes than blue nodes, and I would have cut its subtree. So it creates all these nasty dependencies along the tree model. Instead, what you need care in these things is how to design an adversary that not only breaks one particular algorithm, but actually puts you back into a nice model on a tree, where, for example, nodes are conditionally independent given their parents. And then we can follow the usual pattern of how to embed the broadcast tree model in the stochastic block model to prove the overall result. So what we showed is sort of a precursor to this idea that helpful changes can hurt in the stochastic block model, is the fact that in the semi-random model for the broadcast tree model, the same type of tension between sharpness and robustness happens. Even though the Keston-Stigov bound is this well-storied and famous sharp threshold that prescribes that majority is optimal, once you allow these changes about cutting alternating edges, all of a sudden you can move the information during threshold. What I think is pretty neat, and this is where the talk will get a little bit more philosophical, is that once you start studying which algorithms do work in the semi-random model, you get some interesting phenomena. So instead of majority, there's a variant of it that actually does work, which is recursive majority. See, majority ignores the entire topology of the tree. It just looks at the colors of the leaves and adds up how many red there are and how many blue there are and takes the majority vote. But there's something else you can do, something called a recursive majority, where what you do is you fill in the colors as you go up the tree. You take into account the topology. When you have the colors of the leaves, you take the next highest level, the next lowest level, and you take for each node the majority vote of its children. And then you take for the higher level of that, the majority vote of its children, and then you fill in all the way up. So the cool thing is, even though majority reconstruction breaks spectacularly once you allow any deviations to the model, because majority vote is kind of over-tuning to one particular nice distribution, recursive majority actually does work under some interesting regime of parameters. And what's really neat about this is that actually in practice, people use recursive majority and not majority when they do these types of inverse problems on trees. So recursive majority is used in practice, even though for many decades we've known that majority is tight. So we can ask the question, why do people prefer recursive majority? And I would venture, I'd hazard a guess that one of the reasons really does have to do with this robustness, is that, in the broadcast tree model, majority looks better than recursive majority. It achieves a better threshold, and majority gets all the way down to the Kestenstiga value. But recursive majority continues to work even when you make some changes to the model. So maybe this lends some credence to why people prefer it in practice. So philosophically, I want to say that the models we use, especially average case models, where we want to prove some nice guarantees for our algorithms, well, these models, we choose them for their simplicity and elegance. Things like the stochastic block model is a really elegant way to create a random graph with plant and community structure. But these random models are just one particular measuring stick for comparing algorithms. So it's not always clear that we're using the best one. So when we have average case models, we have lots of algorithms that do work, and we have this danger that we end up looking for the algorithm which works the best on that one average case model, and we might be overfitting to some elegant but ultimately not that realistic model. So semi-random models, I think, are this beautiful gem which deserve to be better known, which give you a way of stress testing your assumptions. So they allow changes to your model that sound like they shouldn't destroy the performance of your algorithm. But the real surprise is that a lot of algorithms that you prove guarantees for really do break under these types of changes that sound like they ought not to hurt. So this is actually an axis on which now recursive majority is superior, so it can explain perhaps why people prefer these things. So what I want to mention, as I've said, I'm a theoretical computer scientist. A lot of times we study problems from the other end of the spectrum. So instead of average case analysis, we're usually thinking about worst case analysis. So can we design algorithms which work no matter what on every configuration of inputs? And the surprise, or maybe not surprise, over the last many decades is that that's really hard. It just doesn't lend itself to solving many algorithmic problems, because there's so many algorithmic problems that seem to be solved in practice, but when you look at them from a worst case lens, they're just too hard to give any sort of guarantees. So within theory, there's this emerging direction, which sometimes is called beyond worst case analysis, which what people really mean is they use it as code for beneath worst case. That, all right, worst case analysis is really hard to get guarantees, algorithms that work no matter what. So let's try and take a little nibble outside of worst case analysis to make our lives easier. Maybe we can design some interesting algorithms then. So one of the most famous results is a result of Spielman and Tang, which takes the simplex method, which doesn't work in a worst case sense, but studies it in something called smooth analysis, which is a way of taking a little perturbation on a worst case instance, and all of a sudden you have algorithms that do work. So their goal was to try and explain why algorithms behave well in practice despite their bad worst case behavior. And semi-random models usually fit into this category of being beyond worst case analysis, or in our language, beneath worst case. And so what I really think is that these semi-random models, we should really think about them from the other perspective. That worst case analysis is so passé that everyone studies average case analysis anyways. But to what extent are our guarantees for average case analysis over-tuned to one and only one distribution? So maybe semi-random models give us a way to stress test on the other side, and it's good to think about them not as beneath worst case analysis, but as being above average case analysis, that they take a slight nibble outside of the stochastic model that destroys some of the very precise regularity properties that you might be building your algorithm based on. So in this one setting, I showed you some aspect of how semi-random models show you some more of the picture than is revealed just through average case analysis. And I want to end with some open questions, because I think this notion of going above average case has many interesting implications for things like machine learning. So one of my favorite problems is matrix completion. So sometimes you'll hear it called the Netflix problem. So what's happening there, I don't want to get into too many technical details because it's late. I'm still on East Coast time. We're given some matrix M, which is approximately low rank. So you can think of this as the Netflix problem where you have users and movies that they're rating. And usually the reason you think it's approximately low rank is because there's some sort of preference structure that's driving this low rank aspect. Maybe you can represent M approximately as a sum of not too many rank 1 components, where one of the components represents which movies are, appeal to someone who's interested in drama and which users are interested in drama. And the same for some of the other categories. So the usual model for matrix completion is that we have this approximately low rank matrix, and we're given uniformly random observations from this matrix. So you take random observations from this matrix and then the reveal, and your goal is to try and reconstruct the underlying matrix. So the basic question is there an efficient algorithm to recover M from not too many observations from it? So I can't do justice to all of the work here, but really there's two main approaches to this problem. One is the convex programming formulation, where what you do is borrowing on a lot of the insights from things like compressed sensing. What you do is you write a convex program that the same way replaces some L0 norm with an L1 norm, except now it's happening with the singular values. So instead you do something called the nuclear norm, which is just the sum of the singular values of X. You look for among all matrices X that agree with the observations you've seen, that's the set omega. You're looking for the X that has the smallest nuclear norm, that's your complexity measure for the hypothesis you find that explains your data. So this was introduced in Maryam Faisal's PhD thesis, and a lot of beautiful works have shown guarantees for this type of approach. And sort of archetypal guarantees that, let's say you have an n by n matrix that has rank R and is incoherent. It's kind of late for defining what incoherent is, so let's not worry about it. That if you're given observations, roughly n times R times polylog n uniformly random observations from the matrix, then what you recover from solving this convex optimization problem is a true underlying matrix. There are even versions of this that work in the presence of noise when the thing is not exactly low rank. But there's really a competing approach. In the same way for computer detection, there were semi-definite programs and there were non-convex methods. Here's the archetypal non-convex method for matrix completion, is to do something quite different, is alternating minimization. So the idea is, if you're given the constraints, the values of M in these different locations, looking for the factors U and V that are the low-rank factorization of M, that's a non-convex problem because you're looking for both U and V, so you get quadratic constraints. So the idea is just to alternate between optimizing over them. You treat V as fixed, and you look for the best U that agrees to the observations so far, and that becomes a convex optimization problem. It's just least squares. And then you treat U as fixed, and you look for the best V. And you just alternate back and forth between these. So this is some iterative method for trying to solve a non-convex optimization problem, looking for the best rank R explanation of the matrix. And what's neat is that there are also guarantees known for this. They're a little bit weaker, but they're still pretty darn strong. That if you're given n times some polynomial in R observations, then you can recover a good approximation to the underlying matrix, again, under the assumption that it's incoherent. So this now, what it sounds like is it almost sounds like non-convex methods are just better for these types of problems. They get slightly worse statistical guarantees, and that is an issue to try and improve them, to remove this type of Frobenius norm dependence. But the main thing is that you're not solving a convex program. So the original approach was actually looking for an n-by-n matrix. This thing isn't even looking for an n-by-n matrix because it's looking for two n-by-r matrices. So this algorithm is much more space efficient and has much better running time, so it sounds like it just dominates it. But actually, let's take the same lens. So let's use this lens of, can making the model sound like it's only easier actually hurt algorithms? Let's try applying it here. So what if an adversary actually reveals more entries of the matrix? So the stochastic part of the problem is in assuming that your observations are uniformly at random. But what if an adversary comes along and shows you more of the matrix? That again just sounds like it makes your life easier. And actually, if you're a convex program, it really does, because showing you more of the matrix just adds more constraints into your convex optimization problem. Maybe you can add like an L-infinity constraint, then it literally is just adding more constraints. So once it works, it still continues to work, even when an adversary reveals more entries. But actually, it turns out, this was a little bit surprising to me, the analysis for alternate minimization completely breaks down. So that's kind of neat. It's because at the core of alternate minimization is the assumption that whenever you take a random sample of observations from a matrix, if you reweight it, you'll get a good spectral approximation of the underlying matrix. Once an adversary can show you more of the matrix, that actually goes out the window. So I think this is another example of the types of questions one can get to with this lens of sort of robustness. Robustness, I think it's important to not take just one notion of robustness. There really is no right notion. It depends on which problem you're interested in solving, the problem at hand. But even these other notions of robustness that sound like they're vacuously satisfying, things like the semi-random model in community detection, or this model in matrix completion where I show you more of the matrix, are actually not as easy to solve as you would think. That actually they destroy a lot of the algorithms that we know and love, which we have analyses for. So I think this is, looking forward, this is a great direction for future research, is that for starters, non-convex methods and a lot of these types of recovery problems, matrix completion, robust PCA, they sound like they get pretty darn strong guarantees and faster. But they're missing some aspect of the robustness that we get from convex programs. So can we get the best of both worlds? Can we get the speed and the speed and space complexity of these non-convex methods, but also with the robustness guarantees we would get from convex programs? That's an interesting direction for trying to explore robustness within a whole host of other problems. And more generally, the thing I'll encourage you to do is that I think robustness, because it's so difficult to obtain, especially in high-dimensional robust statistics, I think it hasn't received that much attention from, say, the algorithms and machine learning communities. And I think a great question to apply to your own work is, well, to think about what models of robustness, there is no universal answer to this, make sense for your favorite problems, and what can you do with them, theoretically and empirically. All right, so it's been a long day, so I'll thank you and I'll stop there and take any questions you guys have.